A cool breeze slipped through the open window of Margaret Collins' kitchen as she stood at the counter, slicing apples for the pie she had promised to bring to her neighbor's book club that evening. Margaret was 59, a retired schoolteacher, and someone who had lived most of her life quietly in a small town in Ohio. She had raised 2 children, both grown and now living in different states, and she filled her days with gardening, volunteering at the library, and baking. Her life was not extraordinary, but it was steady, peaceful, and filled with small routines she had grown to cherish. That afternoon, she had placed a large grocery order online. It was easier than driving into town, and her knees ached too much these days to push a heavy cart through crowded aisles. She expected the usual delivery from a familiar driver, maybe someone in their 30s or 40s, polite but distant, the type who unloaded the bags quickly and hurried back to their truck. She had no idea that the person who would show up at her doorstep would change the way she saw herself and the world around her. The knock on the door came just as she was wiping flour from her hands. Margaret opened it, expecting the same familiar face. Instead, standing before her was a boy who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. His cap was tilted slightly backward, a mop of sandy brown hair peeking out, and his smile was as bright as the summer sun. His name tag read, Ethan. "Delivery for Mrs. Collins?" he asked, his voice cheerful and warm. Margaret blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected someone so young. He looked barely older than her grandson. For a moment, she wondered if the company had made a mistake. "Yes, that's me," she replied, stepping aside. "You can bring them right into the kitchen, thank you." Ethan carried the bags in with surprising strength, moving easily despite the weight. Margaret noticed how carefully he placed each one on the counter, making sure not to crush the bread or bruise the fruit. He worked with a politeness that felt almost old-fashioned, thanking her when she held the door wider and making small talk as he unpacked. "So, do you do this often?" Margaret asked, trying to ease the silence. "Almost every day," Ethan said, grinning. "I'm saving up for college. My parents live nearby, but I'm trying to cover most of my tuition myself. Deliveries, odd jobs, you name it." Margaret felt a pang of admiration. At his age, she remembered being uncertain about everything. The idea of a young man working this hard for his future impressed her deeply. "Well, that's very responsible of you," she said warmly. "Not many young people would put in that kind of effort." He shrugged modestly, though his eyes lit up at the praise. "I figure hard work now will make things easier later." When he finished, he handed her the receipt, but before leaving, he paused. His gaze drifted to the pie dish waiting by the stove. "That smells amazing," he said with a boyish enthusiasm that made her chuckle. "Apple pie," Margaret said, a little proud. "It's for my neighbor's book club. I've been baking since I was younger than you." Ethan's face lit up. "My grandma used to bake pies every Sunday when I was a kid. Haven't had one in years, though." The words touched Margaret. There was something sincere about him, something that reminded her of her own son when he was Ethan's age, hopeful and full of energy. Without overthinking it, she said, "Would you like a slice? I always bake too much, and I can't possibly eat it all myself." Ethan hesitated, almost as if it was too good to be true. Then he nodded, his smile growing wide. "I'd love that if it's not too much trouble." Margaret cut him a generous slice and set it on a plate. They sat at the small kitchen table, the ticking clock filling the space between their conversation. Ethan ate with such delight that she couldn't help but laugh. "This is incredible," he said between bites. "Honestly, it tastes just like how my grandma used to make it." Margaret felt her heart warm in a way she hadn't expected. She had grown used to being invisible to younger people, often dismissed as just another older woman in the background. But Ethan looked at her as though she mattered, as though she was worth listening to. Over the next half hour, he told her about his plans to study architecture, his love for sketching buildings, and how he dreamed of designing homes that felt as warm as his grandmother's. Margaret shared stories of her years as a teacher, of children who had grown into adults and sometimes came back to thank her. The delivery that should have taken 5 minutes stretched into nearly an hour, and when Ethan finally stood to leave, he looked reluctant. "Thank you again, Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone respectful but genuine. "This was the best delivery I've ever had." After he left, Margaret sat quietly at the table, the empty plate still in front of her. She was shocked, not by anything inappropriate, but by how deeply the simple encounter had touched her. She had not realized how much she craved genuine connection, how much she had missed the feeling of being seen and valued. In the days that followed, she found herself thinking of Ethan more than she expected. Not in a romantic way, but in a way that stirred something dormant in her. A reminder that life was still full of surprises, even at 59. When her next grocery delivery arrived a week later, she was almost embarrassed by how much she hoped it would be him again. And when Ethan appeared at her door, smiling as though he too was glad to see her, she knew their unexpected friendship had only just begun.